Hey folks, Mark Yerkes here, coming to you from the beautiful walled city of Dubrovnik, Croatia. If the walls look familiar, it may be that you have seen them on the Game of Thrones series, which shot here for many years. But we're not here for that. We're here to look at a little bit of church history. So join me as we explore Dubrovnik. Whether you arrive in Dubrovnik by bus or by cruise ship, you will most likely be brought to the western gate of the walled inner city. Tour and local buses drop their passengers near the main tourism information office, where you can get a map and other information. Guided tours often begin at this drop-off point, and the first view of Dubrovnik's most prominent feature sets the tone for what is to come. The defensive wall surrounds the old town, but seeing how it rises above the waters of the Croatian coast helps one to better understand how formidable it was in the centuries when needed most. A moat on the land sides added to the danger for invaders. But tourists simply walk across the Pile Bridge to reach the outer gate, though some citizens of Dubrovnik might consider the huge number of tourists more as a Game of Thrones invasion. Many visitors come to see locations that were shot here during the series. Even without the Hollywood magic of computer graphics, one can still recognize the settings for Blackwater Bay, the Red Dungeon, King's Landing Harbor, the House of the Undying, and King's Landing itself. This notoriety has created a love-hate relationship. Tourism brings a welcome source of income and recognition, but the crowds can also be a nuisance, a disruption to tranquility. The main street, known as Stradun, is the most touristic part of town because it is fronted by the important historic buildings. During peak hours, especially in the summer, so many people fill the Stradun that it is difficult to breathe, let alone move. Fewer people actually live in the old town these days. Many of the residents moved out to convert their properties into profitable accommodations. Even the businesses are tourist-oriented. Rather than butcher shops and shoe cobblers, you will find currency exchange offices, souvenir shops, ice cream stores, and restaurants. A small indoor meat and grocery market does remain within the walls for the locals, if you can find it. But the outdoor stalls in Wonderliv Square are clearly aimed at tourists. Prices in Dubrovnik are high, not only in the stores, but also in the restaurants closest to the main pedestrian streets on level ground. If you want more reasonable prices, you will have to do some stair climbing, or leave the old city. Not that climbing can be totally avoided in any case. The most popular must-do activity in Dubrovnik is to walk the walls. Climbing the ramparts may not be practical for the physically challenged, but if one can manage, the views will not disappoint. Dubrovnik is a World Heritage Site in recognition of its medieval architecture and history. As you explore the old town, the former Republic of Ragusa, you will find a mixture of cultures represented, from the ancient Greek and Roman influences to its prominence as a city-state to the century and a half under Venetian rule, and its gradual assimilation into Croatian culture. Along with its rich heritage, it retains a distinctive religious history as well. The Ottoman conquest had spread Islam to regions which comprise modern Macedonia, Albania, and Bosnia-Herzegovina. Eastern Orthodoxy was predominant in the region that more effectively resisted the Ottomans, such as Serbia and Montenegro. These countries surrounded the modern Republic of Croatia, which, being directly across the Adriatic Sea from Italy and bordered on the north by Slovenia and Hungary, is predominantly Roman Catholic, but with a Serbian Orthodox minority. Later, we will discuss how these divisions fueled the Balkans War in the 1990s. But for now, let's concentrate upon Croatia's Catholic faith. We can see the powerful influence of Catholicism from the moment we enter the Old City. The church located near the Old Harbor is dedicated to Saint Blaise, the patron saint of Dubrovnik, who reportedly, through a vision to a local canon, saved the city from an attack by Venetians in the 10th century. Ironically, the Venetians eventually did conquer and rule Dubrovnik, and this church was built in 1715 in a Venetian Baroque style by a Venetian architect. Images of St. Blaise, holding a staff and dressed in a bishop's robe and mitre, can be seen throughout the city. At the church, above the city gates, and even a statue at the base of the wall facing the Adriatic. The saint, who was martyred in the early 4th century, is venerated in Dubrovnik on February 3, with a procession of some of his relics. He is also recognized as the patron saint of those with throat ailments, so that local parishioners receive a special blessing on this day with crossed candles upon their throats. Dubrovnik has its own cathedral, a variety of churches and chapels, and several monasteries, including ones for the Jesuit, Dominican, and Franciscan orders. Dubrovnik is a very popular tourist destination, and it can get crowded out there. Even today, I'm here at the end of October, which is the off-season, but still there are plenty of tourists to go around. Sometimes you just need to get away and find a nice restful spot. I have found one here in the Franciscan monastery, a quiet garden, and right next to it is the third oldest pharmacy in the world, established in 1317. From the very beginning, the Franciscans believed in serving their fellow man, no matter what the cost. They did not serve just the wealthy who could afford the medicine. They used it as a medical mission to reach out the gospel to others. And I think that's probably the forebears of all kinds of medical missions that take place in the church today. Though the Catholic Church was and is highly regarded in Dubrovnik, the people retained their own sense of freedom and justice for the poor and oppressed. For instance, while much of the Catholic world was persecuting Jews in other countries during the Middle Ages, the leaders of Dubrovnik were more open-minded. 1492 is well remembered as the year Christopher Columbus sailed the ocean blue to the Americas. But that was also the year in which the monarchs of Spain, Ferdinand and Isabella, issued an edict that all Jews must either convert to Christianity and be baptized, or be expelled. The Jews had already been suffering under the persecution of the Spanish Inquisition, and this edict left most with no other choice than to flee for their lives. But where could they go? They were not welcome in most Catholic countries. Many found a better reception in Eastern Orthodox regions, but at least one independent Catholic city received Jewish refugees from Portugal, Spain, and Italy. And that was Dubrovnik. I wish that I could report that all aspects of Christian history are good and positive, but such is not the case. The only problem with the church, as some people say, is that people are involved with it. And we know that all people have a sin nature. Right now I'm standing in Ulica Żydowska. I'm sure I really messed up the name, but this is the Jewish street. This was the ghetto, going all the way back to the 13th century where the Jewish people lived. It is a very small section, a very small street, and the far end of it, which goes into the major street, the square, had a gate which locked it off and separated it from the rest of the Dubrovnik community. Now, that sounds terrible, but it's not quite as bad as it may seem, especially considering the rising tide of anti-Semitism that was taking place throughout the rest of Europe. On this street is the second oldest synagogue for Sephardic Jews within Europe, second only to the synagogue in Prague. Today, only 45 to 50 Jewish people still live in Dubrovnik, and they still use the synagogue for special occasions. In most European cities, the Jews were forced into the worst areas and out of public sight. But in Dubrovnik, their street entered the Stradun in the best part of town, close to the harbor, and a few yards from the plaza containing the Church of St. Blaise, and fronted by the bell tower, the city hall, and the Sponza Palace. The attitude towards the Jews did fluctuate at various times in the following centuries, but they finally received the status of legal equality in the mid-19th century. At the beginning of the Second World War, there were about 250 Jews living in Dubrovnik. The partisans managed to help some escape to free territories, but the Germans removed the rest to Rab and other concentration camps. The Jewish community in Dubrovnik never fully recovered, but the continued existence of their synagogue testifies to God's faithful promise there would always be a remnant of Abraham's descendants. And that brings us to a discussion of the Balkan War.
There is no evidence the Yugoslav army is listening, yet another ceasefire has collapsed.
As mentioned before, the Balkan countries north of Greece are divided by ethnicity, culture, and religion. Even within specific territories, there were distinctive pockets of hatred against their neighbors, which had existed far back into history. Following the Second World War, somehow, the hero of the Nazi resistance, Marshal Josip Tito, managed to hold most of these diverse groups together under the heavy hand of communism, until his death in 1980. The Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, without its enigmatic leader, then began a decade-long dissolution as nationalism and calls for independence rose. Sides were taken. By 1991, conflict was inevitable. Serbs versus Slovenes and Croats, Bosnian Muslims versus Bosnian and Serb Christians. The contagion spread. Genocidal atrocities followed. The United Nations got involved. Yet one event, more than any other, solidified public contempt against the aggressors: the Siege of Dubrovnik.
In 1991, Dubrovnik was under siege. Croatia had declared independence from Yugoslavia and was being punished with an attack on its greatest asset and source of tourist income. My ITV News team was inside the siege, the only ones to capture its darkest hours.
They warned the Croatian garrison surrender or face the consequences. Few people in the world could have realized that this was what they meant by consequences.
Naval forces and Yugoslav army corps from Montenegro came against Dubrovnik in October of 1991. The people of Dubrovnik knew that the fortress built by Napoleon atop Mount Srd was a key to holding the city. Visitors can reach the fortress ruins by hiking a trail marked by the Catholic Stations of the Cross, or one can more easily take a cable car to the top. Outnumbered and undertrained Croatian soldiers lacking sufficient weaponry, and citizens who had never before touched a gun, came to defend the fortress and city. About 280 Croatians died during the 7-month siege, but the Yugoslav military was eventually driven back and defeated. A number of the invaders later were found guilty of war crimes like looting, arson, and murder. There is a small memorial museum along the Stradun, which remembers those who gave their final breaths to save their families and way of life. It was a moral victory at great cost. But there is also another victory to be told. The Serbian-Montenegrin forces that bombarded the city were Eastern Orthodox, and of all the churches in Dubrovnik, only one was not Catholic. the Serbian Orthodox Church of the Annunciation. Like so many of the buildings in the city, this church was among the more than 11,000 damaged by bomb shells, and it would be understandable if the people of Dubrovnik were to bear a grudge and turn a blind eye. But they did not. In 2009, the Ministry of Culture in Croatia and the city of Dubrovnik paid for the restoration of the church. Christianity is built upon a foundation of love and forgiveness, not bitterness and hatred. Of all the religious sites in Dubrovnik, this church is perhaps the greatest example of the Christian obligation to be kind to one another, tender-hearted, forgiving one another as God in Christ forgave you.